Jackie Kennedy's jewelry was armor, diplomacy, and memory all at once. But some called her the most greedy first lady in history, a mercenary woman who married for money and sold designer clothes out the back door. Both portraits are accurate. That's what most accounts refuse to hold simultaneously. April 23, 1996, Sotheby's, New York. The auction house opens for 4 days of bidding on the estate of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, dead of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma at 64, 23 months prior. The catalogue, white cotton cover, discreet silver lettering, the name Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis in full, had already sold 105,000 copies at $90 for the hardcover. Thousands gathered outside before the doors opened. Bidders arrived from 19 countries. Sotheby's had received 125,000 absentee bids. By the time the last lot cleared on April 26th, 1,301 objects had crossed the block. Every single one sold. Not one returned to storage. Pre-sale estimate? $4.6 million. Final realized total? $34,457,470. A three-strand faux pearl necklace, costume jewelry, worth somewhere between $500 and $700 at retail, sold for $211,500. That gap between what a thing is worth and what people will pay for, it's the engine of the whole story. And Jackie Kennedy built the engine herself. Jacqueline Lee Bouvier was born July 28, 1929, in Southampton, New York. Her father, John Vernew Blackjack Bouvier III, was a Wall Street broker, darkly handsome, financially volatile, constitutionally extravagant, the kind of man who understood the theatricality of money better than its management. Her parents' marriage was a sustained public catastrophe that produced 2 daughters and a decade of turbulence before the divorce. Her mother remarried Hugh Auchincloss, a man of more stable, less exciting wealth. Jackie absorbed both lessons. Spectacle gets attention, security keeps it. She spoke 4 languages, read Greek and French literature in the original, and in 1951 won Vogue magazine's Prix de Paris competition from a field of 1,279 candidates. The prize included 6 months working in Vogue's Manhattan offices, followed by 6 months in Paris. She quit on her first morning. The editorial floor was too full of women to serve her longer-term purposes, and her longer-term purpose was a specific kind of marriage. That's not a retrospective judgment. Multiple biographies, drawing on letters and interviews with people who knew her at 22, make the calculation explicit. In 1952, she briefly engaged herself to Wall Street businessman John Husted. Her mother felt his $17,000 annual salary was insufficient. The engagement dissolved after 3 months. Senator John F. Kennedy arrived in her orbit in 1953. They married September 12th at St. Mary's Church in Newport, Rhode Island. Her wedding jewelry included a strand of family pearls, a diamond leaf brooch given by Joseph and Rose Kennedy as a wedding present, and a nautical rope bracelet containing 25 diamonds and 18 pearls presented to her the night before the ceremony. That bracelet would later be donated to the JFK Presidential Library and Museum. The objects of Jackie Kennedy's life had a way of ending up in institutional custody. The first catastrophic year came within 3. On August 23, 1956, Jackie delivered a stillborn daughter at a Rhode Island hospital. This wasn't a miscarriage. She had carried the baby close to term before the loss. The couple used the name Arabella, though it appeared on no official birth certificate. They never formally named her. JFK wasn't present. He was on a sailing trip off the Italian coast with friends. Bobby Kennedy flew down to comfort Jackie and oversee burial arrangements. Arabella was later reinterred at Arlington National Cemetery after JFK's assassination, placed beside her father. Jackie had suffered miscarriages at other points, too, separate losses. The medical record distinguishes between them even when the popular account collapses everything into a single narrative of grief. She navigated pregnancy loss of multiple kinds, publicly and mostly alone, while maintaining the face of a political wife who wasn't supposed to have private suffering. 14 months after Arabella's birth, on November 27, 1957, Caroline Kennedy was born. 3 years after that, on November 25, 1960, JFK Jr. arrived, 2 weeks after Kennedy won the presidency. The myth came later, built deliberately. On November 23, 1963, the day after Dallas, Jackie called journalist Theodore White of Life magazine and invited him to the Kennedy family home in Hyannisport. Over the course of that interview, she steered him toward a specific image. Her husband had loved the Lerner and Loewe musical Camelot, played it on an old Victrola at night, found something in its lyric about a brief, shining moment. White published it in the December 1963 issue of Life. For the rest of the century, JFK's 1,000-day presidency would be understood through that frame. White later said privately that Jackie wanted Camelot to top the story. He called it a misreading of history. She knew it was. She chose it anyway. That's the first and most important thing to understand about every piece of jewelry she ever wore. It was deployed by someone who understood exactly what images did and didn't do. On January 11, 1961, 9 days before his inauguration, President-elect John Kennedy walked into Tiffany & Company and purchased a brooch. The JFK Presidential Library's Artifacts Archive holds the record. Purchase date, January 11, 1961. The piece had been designed by Jean Schlumberger, Tiffany's most celebrated jewelry director, originally produced in Paris in 1956. 2 small fruit clusters, sometimes called the berry sprig, sometimes the twin acorn, sometimes simply the 2-fruit clip pin, set with 37 diamonds totaling 1.04 carats in the leaves and 80 rubies totaling 9.15 carats in the berries. Kennedy commissioned it to mark the birth of his son. Christie's, when they catalogued a comparable Schlumberger piece years later, described the occasion directly. President John F. Kennedy gave a similar brooch in 1960 to Jacqueline Kennedy upon the birth of their son, John F. Kennedy, Jr. Jackie wore it at the inauguration on January 20th. She wore it in Paris on June 2, 1961. The state visit during which Kennedy introduced himself to the assembled press as the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris. She wore it at the Vienna summit with Khrushchev in June 1961, and again at the National Gallery of Art in Washington on November 3, 1961. 4 documented appearances in 1 year, at 4 of the most photographed and politically significant moments of the early Kennedy administration. A ruby and diamond brooch, not quite the size of a fist, doing diplomatic work. Holly Carew, in a 2024 undergraduate history thesis from Providence College, analyzing Jackie's Cold War strategy, describes her fashion choices as a branding of the American national image. Not personal vanity, but deliberate policy, designed to project Western prosperity, cultural authority, and feminine power in the same gesture. The berry sprig at Vienna was part of that. So was the way Jackie spoke French to de Gaulle at Versailles, while JFK stood beside her. She had identified an intersection between personal style and national interest, and she worked it with the discipline of someone who'd been preparing for it her entire life. The berry sprig didn't go to the 1996 Sotheby's auction. Jackie's estate donated it to the JFK Library Foundation in 1995, the year after her death. In 2009, it was transferred to the JFK Presidential Library and Museum in Boston, where it's accessible to anyone who goes to look. That decision to move it into public custody before the commercial auction, That's the first signal in this story that not everything was transactional. Jackie's relationship with the French jeweler Van Cleef and April, that's the correct pronunciation, Van Cleef and April, with the S at the end of Arpels silent, as it is in French, ran through the most significant chapters of her adult life. The most devastating piece in that relationship never arrived as intended. In early 1963, JFK commissioned a custom ring from Van Cleef and Arpels, a 10th anniversary gift, 10 emerald stones set in gold, one for each year of their marriage. They'd married September 12, 1953. The ring was to mark September 12, 1963. It was delivered to the White House in early November 1963. Kennedy left for Dallas on November 21st. He was assassinated the following day, November 22, 1963. The anniversary ring commissioned as a gesture of something, a marriage that by all documented accounts included years of Kennedy's serial infidelity, multiple mistresses whose names became public after his death, at least one affair Jackie had discovered through a phone call she answered herself, arrived at the White House as a present that was never presented. It ended up part of the estate. What its existence tells you about JFK is a separate question from what its existence tells you about Jackie. He commissioned it. Whatever he was, he commissioned it. Jackie owned multiple Van Cleef and Arpels pieces across her life. A sapphire and diamond bracelet she traded in 1961 to help purchase another piece. Hammered gold cuffs she wore to the RFK tennis tournament in the 1970s. Prominently enough that a subsequent book on jewelry fashion history credits her appearance with a measurable uptick in sales of the style. When Aristotle Onassis married her on October 20, 1968, his wedding gifts included a set of ruby and diamond ear clips and a matching ring from Van Cleef and Arpels. That set sold at Christie's in 2015 for $301,959. The house was present at her two marriages, her first widowhood, her second widowhood, and her estate sale. It was the one constant. The financial architecture behind the elegance began forming long before Onassis. Jackie entered her marriage to JFK with almost no independent money of her own. The Kennedy family's wealth belonged to Joe Kennedy, and Joe Kennedy used it to serve Joe Kennedy's objectives, primary among them being the political advancement of his sons. What Jackie received in exchange for being the ideal wife of a presidential candidate was protection from the financial precarity that had haunted her father's side of her family. What she provided in exchange was compliance with a public image she hadn't designed and a marriage she didn't always find livable. According to J. Randy Taraborelli, whose 2023 biography, Jackie, Public, Private, Secret, is described by reviewers as the most thoroughly researched Kennedy biography in decades, Joe Kennedy formalized the arrangement over lunch at Le Pavilion, a French restaurant in New York City. The offer, as Taraborelli documents it from interviews with Kennedy family members and associates, $100,000 for any child Jackie carried to term. In November 1957, Jackie gave birth to Caroline Kennedy. Joe Kennedy, the book claims, deposited the money that same day. A previous version of this story, told by biographer C. David Heyman in his 1989 book, A Woman Named Jackie, put the figure at $1 million as a single payment for agreeing to stay in the marriage. In 2014, Newsweek published a detailed investigation into Heyman's work under the headline, See David Heyman's Lies About JFK and Jackie, Marilyn Monroe, and Elizabeth Taylor. The investigation documented fabricated interview sources, invented dialogue attributed to dead people who couldn't contradict it, and methodology that academic reviewers had used as a case study in how not to write a biography. The $1 million figure originated with a man whose entire body of work has been credibly challenged. Taraborelli's account, $100,000 per child, a specific lunch at a specific restaurant, a specific mechanism, is sourced differently, and his biographer's track record is considerably cleaner. The overlap between the two accounts is structural. Joe Kennedy managed his son's marriage as a financial asset, and Jackie understood this and worked within it. The specific numbers are disputed. The dynamic isn't. After Dallas, the financial reality was immediate and harsh. The Kennedy family extended Jackie a modest monthly allowance, but no real independence. Tara Borelli documents that she left the White House effectively broke, that when contractors worked on her new home, she asked them to accept signed photographs as payment, arguing the photographs would appreciate in value. They declined and asked for checks. The most famous woman on earth, newly widowed, negotiating with contractors over signed photographs. She was 34. She was going to do something about this. That something was Aristotle Onassis, but not the way the tabloid framing suggests it. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated in June 1968. Jackie reportedly told people around her, "They are killing Kennedys." The calculation she made in the months that followed wasn't purely financial. Biographer Barbara Leeming has documented her post-traumatic stress following Dallas, which intensified after Bobby's death, and the genuine security concern she had for her children in a country where 2 Kennedy men had been shot. But the financial component was real, and she made no significant effort to hide it. In August 1968, Ted Kennedy flew to Scorpios, Onassis's private island in the Ionian Sea, to negotiate the marriage contract on Jackie's behalf. BBC News confirmed this in 2015, citing journalist Nikos Masterakis, who was present. Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, brother of the slain president, flew to a Greek island to negotiate his sister-in-law's prenuptial agreement. The New York Times reported on November 1, 1971, when the contract's terms leaked to the press. The marriage agreement between Jackie Kennedy and Aristotle Onassis required 170 clauses. 170. A California newspaper, printing from the same leaked document, reported the key provision. Onassis is committed to lay out the sum of at least $625,000 a year for his wife's comfort, pleasure, and children. Tara Borelli's research, drawing on separate sources, records a $3 million initial payment before the wedding and $200,000 annually thereafter. The figures don't fully reconcile with the $625,000 annual figure in the press report. Either different sources counted differently, or the $625,000 included provisions beyond Jackie's personal allowance. What isn't disputed is the structure. Ted Kennedy had negotiated specific dollar amounts. Jackie had a senator as her financial representative. The marriage contract was an instrument of financial independence, not just a romantic commitment. Onassis's daughter Christina and son Alexander called her the gold digger from the start. Greek newspapers coined the phrase, "Jackie marries blank check." The American press ran headlines about Kennedy's second death. The biographer who later wrote about the marriage most thoroughly, Jill Paul, in a historical novel about Jackie and Maria Callas, concludes in her parallel nonfiction analysis that Jackie did marry Onassis primarily for financial security, and then places that fact in its actual historical context. In 1950, only 26% of married women worked outside the home. The available mechanisms for financial independence were limited. Jackie used the ones available to her with exceptional precision. The first year of the marriage reportedly cost $1.25 million, mostly clothing purchased in New York, according to biographer Peter Evans and multiple secondary sources. The specific practice of charging couture to Onassis's accounts and then reselling pieces through boutiques on Madison Avenue has been described by multiple Kennedy biographers and discussed by people familiar with the household. The Onassis-era version of this practice is described in some sources as legend, acknowledged widely but not documented in primary receipts. What is documented is the scale. Onassis reportedly knew about Jackie's spending habits before he married her, had negotiated against that exact backdrop, and proceeded anyway. The 170 clauses presumably contain some provisions for the clothing budget. One thing attributed to Jackie across multiple biographies, with enough frequency that it appears to represent something she actually said. Money is power, and I want both. If she said it, she wasn't being cynical. She was being precise about the world she'd grown up in. There's a correction that needs to be made clearly, because this specific error has a way of spreading. On August 1st, 1969, Jackie Kennedy Onassis celebrated her 40th birthday on Scorpios. Aristotle Onassis commissioned a gift to mark the occasion, and to mark the fact that 20 days earlier, on July 20th, 1969, human beings had landed on the moon. The earrings he commissioned were made by Ilias Lalaounis, the Greek goldsmith whose Athens workshop had been building a reputation for fine jewelry since the 1940s. Not Van Cleef and April, Lalaounis. Sotheby's official documentation confirms this. Town & Country confirmed it when writing about the design. The Lalaounis Museum in Athens holds archival photographs of the commission. Lalaounis' own children, years later, reimagined the design in tribute to their father's work. They described creating the Apollo earrings their father had custom-made for Aristotle Onassis to give to Jackie in 1969 to commemorate the moon landing. The earrings were gold, hand-hammered, designed in an orbit-like sphere. Jackie's birthstone was ruby, and Onassis had Lalaounis set rubies into the hammered gold. Van Cleef and April did make moon-themed jewelry in 1969. The house responded to the Apollo mission with its own commemorative pieces, which is probably where the attribution confusion originates. But the specific birthday gift, the earrings documented in the Sotheby's 1996 catalogue, were made in Athens by a Greek jeweler for a Greek shipping tycoon's American wife on her 40th birthday, 2 weeks after the moon landing. After Jackie's death, the Lalaounis Museum noted that aside from a few photographs in their archives, no other records of the Apollo earrings survive. They had been auctioned in 1996 and scattered into private collections. By April 1996, the question wasn't whether to sell. The estate had complex tax obligations. Executors valued it at $43.7 million, while the IRS was simultaneously auditing to determine if the true figure was closer to $73 million, with 55% federal tax applying to certain categories of proceeds. The Deseret News reported in December 1996 that after distributing property to the children, making specific bequests, and paying administrative expenses, the estate had $18 million but owed $23 million in taxes. The auction wasn't sentiment. It was arithmetic. Certain decisions had already been made before the auction. The Barry Sprigg brooch was in the JFK Library's custody. Jackie's personal Cartier tank watch, given to her February 23, 1963, by her brother-in-law, Prince Stanislaw Stas Radziwill, inscribed in his handwriting on the back, Stas to Jackie /February 23, 63 /2:05 a.m. to 9:35 p.m., marking the hours of a 50-mile hike they'd completed together in Palm Beach during JFK's National Fitness Challenge, wasn't in the 1996 auction. It passed to John Jr. and then to Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, who wore it photographed walking her dog in New York, the gold case visible at her wrist. Neither John nor his wife was alive to see the watch's later story. It sold at Christie's in 2017 for $379,500, after an undisclosed buyer acquired it from Stas Radziwill's daughter-in-law, Carol Radziwill. By then, it had been 34 years since Stas had clasped it onto Jackie's wrist after a walk in Palm Beach and told her the hours. What went to Sotheby's was the rest. Caroline Kennedy wrote in the auction catalogue's preface, "I found myself again with more houses and belongings than I could possibly use or enjoy." Not a tribute to her mother, not a declaration of public legacy, a logistical statement, more than she could use or enjoy. The auction ran 4 days. Bidders arrived from 19 countries, submitted 125,000 absentee bids, and competed across 1,301 lots. The young designer Michael Kors attended. The Resnicks of the Franklin Mint flew in from California. Jacqueline Onassis's 40.42-carat Marquise-cut Lesotho III engagement ring, the proposal diamond, sold for $2,587,500 against a pre-sale estimate of $600,000. Anthony J. F. O'Reilly, then chairman of H.J. Heinz Company, purchased it for his wife. JFK's wooden desk, at which he had signed the nuclear test ban treaty in 1963, sold for $1,432,500. The estimate had been $20,000 to $30,000. Arnold Schwarzenegger paid $772,500 for a set of McGregor golf clubs. The auction house had estimated $900. A walnut cigar humidor presented to Kennedy by Milton Berle sold for $574,500 against a $2,500 estimate. JFK's rocking chair from the Oval Office went for $453,500. The estimate? $5,000. The ruby and diamond pendant ear clips went for $360,000. The kunzite and diamond ring Kennedy had given Jackie sold for $415,000 against an $8,000 estimate. And then, finally, the pearls. Jacqueline Bouvier had bought the three-strand necklace at Bergdorf Goodman, probably sometime in the 1950s. Kenneth J. Lane had made it. The pearls were imitation. She'd paid roughly $35 for them. Sotheby's cataloged them at $200 to $300. Linda Resnick, who had come specifically to bid on the necklace, paid $211,500, roughly 700 times the high estimate. She later described the purchase in her memoir under the chapter heading, "The One True Copy of Jackie Kennedy's Real Fake Pearls," arguing that the emotional attachment people had to the object was itself a form of real value. The Resnicks put the necklace on a national tour before donating it to the Smithsonian Institution, where it remains on permanent display. Every single one of 1,301 lots sold. The zero unsold rate isn't an accident of how the lots were structured. It's a measure of how completely the Camelot premium had saturated the room. People paid for things not because of what the things were, but because of who had owned them. And who had owned them was a woman who had spent 40 years constructing, defending, and monetizing a mythology that she had invented herself on a November night in Hyannisport, while the country was still in shock. She had told Theodore White what story to write in 1963. In 1996, the market confirmed the story's value. $34,457,470. There's a version of this story that ends with Jackie Kennedy's collection lovingly preserved by her children. The audience has correctly rejected that framing. The children sold $34.5 million worth of their mother's belongings. They also made deliberate prior decisions about what would go to public memory and what would remain in commerce. The Barry Sprigg to the JFK Library, the Tank Watch to John Jr., and then to a woman who wore it on dog walks in Chelsea. What stayed was specific and chosen. Caroline's auction catalog preface holds up as the most honest thing a Kennedy has said publicly about this material. She had more than she could use or enjoy. That's not grief performed for public consumption. It's an accurate accounting of what it means to inherit a mythology from a person who turned image-making into a survival skill. Jackie Kennedy grew up with a father whose money disappeared and a mother who married the money back. She married a man whose father treated the marriage as an asset in a political portfolio. She negotiated a remarriage in 170 clauses. She wore a ruby and diamond brooch at the Vienna summit, and a faux pearl necklace to White House state dinners, and gold orbit earrings on a Greek island, and an anniversary ring that arrived after the man who commissioned it was dead. She burned her private letters before she died, so that what remained was the record she chose to leave. The jewelry is the record. The berry sprig in a museum case in Boston. The Van Cleef and Arpels anniversary ring that never got presented. The La Lunis Apollo earrings, now in private hands somewhere. There's Sotheby's provenance, the only remaining documentation. The faux pearls at the Smithsonian, proof that $35 of imitation jewelry and 30 years of mythology are worth $211,500 on the open market. The armor worked. The diplomacy worked. The memory was managed with precision until the last possible moment. The $34 million was the confirmation. Subscribe for more stories like this.